The apartment held its breath when the phone woke at 12:04 a.m., and Alex Carter answered with a shaking hand. A voicemail bled through the speaker, and a stranger whispered, "They know where you are." Before static drowned the hallway, she stood still, and the city hummed like a warning behind double glass. Alex said, "Who is this?" But the silence answered with a long electric hiss that felt deliberate. A scream cracked the night outside, bright and sharp, and the walls seemed to lean in around her. She grabbed a flashlight and ran to the stairwell, and dust drifted like ash in the beam. The exit door swung on its hinge, and the street beyond looked staged and empty. Alex said, "Hello," and her breath fogged in a faint draft that smelled of rain. On the pavement lay a brass key fob, etched with symbols that bent away from the eye. She reached down, and the alley folded darker, and somewhere a second door clicked shut. Morning crawled in with a washed-out sky, and Alex brewed coffee she did not taste. She replayed the voicemail again, and the whisper felt closer, like breath on the ear. She set the brass fob on a towel, and the symbols seemed to shift when light moved. Alex said, "You are not losing it," and her laugh landed flat in the quiet kitchen. A soft knock at the door made her spine tighten, and she froze mid-sip. Claire Bennett said, "You missed 3 calls last night," through the wood, voice cautious. Alex opened, and Claire's eyes swept the room and fixed on the fob. Claire said, "That looks wrong," and her words trembled around the vowels. Dell clicked off, and the silence after felt shaped like a warning. Alex slid the fob into a drawer, and the air cooled as if the window had opened. They sat at the table, and the blinds striped their faces with pale bands. Claire said, "I heard something outside my place too," and a cupped fear lived in her hands. Alex told her about the scream and the missing doll, and the room shrank with every word. Claire said, "We should call someone," and her breath stuttered on the last syllable. Alex shook her head and traced the towel fibers where the fob had rested. She said, "Not yet," and a memory stirred, heavy as wet rope. The voicemail replayed in her mind, and the whisper seemed to know her name. A siren passed and smeared the walls with blue that faded to gray. Claire looked toward the hallway, and the quiet turned alert, as if listening. They carried the trash to the alley to chase the dread with motion and light. The rain had stopped, and the asphalt held a tired sheen that reflected broken neon. Alex said, "It was here," and pointed to clean brick that should have framed iron. Claire ran her fingers over mortar, and winced at the grit. Claire said, "Maybe you were exhausted," but the hope in her voice rang thin. Alex crouched where the fob had lain, and a faint chill kissed her knuckles. She said, "Something wanted me to find it," and the claim felt like a dare. A cat skittered from a can, and both flinched hard, then laughed too quickly. Far down the alley, a shadow paused and then folded back into the dark. Back upstairs, Alex set a notebook on the counter and sketched the fob from memory. The curves refused to behave, and the lines slipped out of shape as the page turned. She said, "Hold still," to the memory, and her pencil carved deeper grooves. Claire said, "You should rest," but her own eyes avoided the drawer that held the metal. The phone buzzed again, and a new voicemail waited without a missed call tag. Alex pressed play, and her name arrived in a whisper that wore her cadence like a mask. It said, "Open the door you cannot see," and the recording ended with a soft tap. The kitchen clock ticked, and each click sounded like a lock turning. Alex looked at the wall that faced the hallway, and the paint cooled under her stare. Dawn pressed a thin silver line under the blinds, and the apartment felt like a stage left set overnight. Alex Carter brewed coffee she would not finish, and the kettle's sigh called up old winters. She opened the drawer and stared at the brass fob, then shut it like a mouth. Claire Bennett said, "You barely slept," and she tried to smile, but it faltered. Alex traced a ring on the table where a mug used to sit, and the circle would not close. She said, "Something keeps moving the ground," and the words made the air feel thinner. Claire touched her sleeve and said, "Then we stand still together," and the promise steadied the floorboards. The voicemail played in memory, and Alex felt watched by an absence that knew her habits. She lifted the sketchbook, and the symbols warped at the corner of her sight. Claire said, "Tell me everything from the start," and her voice cupped the fragile pieces. Alex spoke, and the telling stitched a seam that still bled at the edges. By late morning they sat across a scarred desk beneath a humming vent, and the precinct smelled of toner and rain. Detective Marcus Harris listened without interrupting, and his pen stayed still. He said, "Doors don't vanish," but the caution in his tone betrayed a softer belief. Alex watched the second hand crawl over a crack in the clock's glass, and time felt cross-wired. Claire said, "She's not making this up," and her voice drew a quiet line in the room. Harris rubbed his temple and said, "File the report, let me ask around," and something in his eyes hid a debt. Alex set the sketch of the symbols on the desk, and the paper refused to lie flat. He slid it back and said, "Take that with you," and the refusal sounded tired. In the hallway a copier jam snapped, and everyone flinched like the past had spoken. Alex left with a receipt, and a feeling that the building had chosen a side. Afternoon wore down the color in the sky, and they walked the long block home with soft steps. Alex said, "I used to dream of a door that led nowhere, and the admission stunned the sidewalk quiet." Claire asked, "When did it start?" and her breath fogged a little in the cooling air. Alex told her about a night when the power failed, and a different key fit every lock. She said, "I never turned it, and the guilt sounded borrowed and old." A bus hissed by and left diesel in their throats, and the world felt a size too big. Claire said, "Not turning it kept you here." And the kindness turned sharp in memory. The voicemail replayed again, and the whisper wore Alex's vowels like stolen clothes. She stopped at the alley mouth and stared at blank brick that felt recently rearranged. Claire laced their arms and said, "We keep moving," and the street agreed by letting the light change. A note waited under the apartment door, and the paper smelled faintly of metal. Alex read, "You are looking at the wall, not the seam," and the letters sloped like a hurry. Claire said someone was here, and checked the chain twice with quick hands. The hallway's bulb hummed higher, and the air carried an iron taste. A knock followed, light as if practicing, and a man stood with rain at his collar. He said, "Jonah Price, I think you found what was meant for me," and he did not blink enough. Alex said, "Tell me why it vanishes," and the steadiness in her voice surprised her. Jonah smiled like a bruise forming and said, "Because it notices attention." Claire stepped between them and said, "Start with how you know our names." He lifted empty hands and said, "Because I used to open it," and the hallway seemed to lose a degree of warmth. They moved inside, and the room closed ranks around the three of them. Jonah traced the air above the wall, as if reading heat, and his fingers shook once. He said, "It appears when consequence peaks, not when you seek it," and the rule felt carved. Alex said, "Someone screamed last night," and the echo traveled the cabinets like a wire. Claire whispered, "Lena Walker never came home," and the name bent the light. Jonah flinched at the surname and said, "She asked me about a seam on this block." The drawer hummed softly, or so it seemed, and the brass fob vibrated a hair's width. Alex pressed her palm on the wood and said, "Then we find her now." Claire nodded and said, "We start where it first moved," and the plan steadied their breaths. Jonah looked at the blank wall and said, "Doors repay attention with appetite," and the room cooled. Night found them back at the alley, and the rain held off like a bargain no one signed. Jonah Price said, "The seam listens before it chooses," and he touched the brick with 2 fingers. Alex Carter held the brass fob and felt a faint tremor travel her wrist. Claire Bennett said, "Lena Walker called me once from this block," and the name tugged the dark tighter. A delivery truck growled past the mouth of the lane and left diesel hanging like a thought. Alex said, "If it notices attention, what does looking away do?" and she shut her eyes. Jonah said, "It once cost," and the words scraped like gravel. Claire counted backward from 5, and the air cooled between numbers. Alex opened her eyes and stared where iron should be, and the wall seemed less convinced of itself. Somewhere a hinge sighed, and the alley breathed in. The wall rippled once like heat above asphalt, and an outline shaped itself just wrong. Alex said, I see it. And the fob warmed as if remembering a palm. Claire stepped back and said, You do not open it alone, and her voice held more steel than fear. Jonah said, Seams take what stands nearest, and he moved to her other side. A thin line of condensation traced a frame that was not there, and the brick forgot its pattern. Alex raised the fob and felt the symbols tilt toward a choice. She said, On 3, and the alley counted with her breath. 1 arrived like a drum beat. 2 came with a faint metallic ping from nowhere. 3 landed heavy, and the outline flashed to iron, and then to absence. The door vanished, but something behind it did not. Pressure swelled like deep water, and a voice that resembled Alex whispered from the blank. It said, Leave what you owe, and the words unstitched the silence. Claire said, You owe nothing to a wall, and anger steadied her posture. Jonah flinched and said, It bargains with echoes, and his breath clouded, though the night was mild. Alex stepped closer and held the fob to her chest as if bracing a wound. She said, Show me Lena Walker. And the alley dimmed a shade. Footsteps approached from the street, measured and official, and a badge caught a blink of neon. Detective Marcus Harris said, What are you doing back here? And his tone chose caution over threat. The outline thinned to a seam again, and the pressure withdrew, leaving a hunger behind. Harris said, You file a report and then trespass, but he glanced at the brick like it had a pulse. Alex said, You saw it bend, and the challenge softened to a plea. Harris rubbed his wrist as if an old injury woke and said, I saw a trick of light. Claire stepped forward and said, Lena Walker is missing, and the name anchored the air. Jonah said, It opens on consequence, and the phrase fell between them like a diagram. A siren moaned far off, and the sound navigated the gap where a door should be. Harris pocketed a small notebook and said, Then we raised the stakes my way. And he nodded toward the street. Alex felt the fob cool as if it disagreed. The seam held, thin as a thought, and the night waited for a plan that might cost too much. They regrouped at the corner diner, and chrome surfaces held a restless mirror of the night. Harris said, You do not chase a myth without leverage, and he slid a photocopy across the booth. The page showed Lena Walker's last parking citation near the alley, time-stamped minutes before the scream. Claire said, She called me after that, and her hands clenched around napkin paper. Jonah traced a line on the map and said, There is another seam 2 blocks east. Alex said, We split the attention, and the plan felt dangerous and correct. Harris weighed the idea and said, I take the east with him, and he nodded at Jonah. Claire said, I stay with Alex, and the team arranged itself like pieces that remembered a board. The diner clock clicked, and the second hand sounded like a latch testing itself. The night deepened, and Alex Carter traced the route on the damp map as if it carried veins. Claire Bennett said, We shouldn't follow it, but her tone trembled between fear and duty. Jonah Price said, It is the only way forward, and his words weighed like stone. Detective Marcus Harris adjusted his coat and said, If another seam exists, it will surface in shadow. The brass fob pulsed faintly in Alex's pocket, and she pressed against it like a heartbeat. They turned east, and the city's neon bled into puddles, leaving fractured reflections. Claire said, Lena Walker walked these blocks too, and her voice carried a tether of memory. Jonah paused at a boarded warehouse and said, Here, while Harris scanned the dark with restless eyes. Alex touched the brick, and the surface rippled once, and the wall exhaled like it had lungs. The seam appeared as a faint outline, trembling like glass about to crack. Alex whispered, It's weaker here, and the fob warmed again, guiding her hand. Claire said, Don't push it, but she stayed close, her breath quick in the mist. Jonah said, Weak doesn't mean safe, and his shoulders squared. Harris placed his hand on the brick, and winced as if burned, and said, Something on the other side wants out. The alley silenced, even the traffic distant and absent, as though the world leaned away. Alex said, Then we listen, and the brick vibrated under her palm. A hollow knock echoed, not from within but from beside them, and a second seam shimmered. Claire gasped, 2 doors, and the thought rewrote the danger instantly. Jonah said, "It chooses now," and all four felt the city shift. A figure emerged from the mist, coat heavy, hat brim low, and his silence pressed harder than noise. Claire whispered, "Who is that?" and Alex gripped the fob tighter, its edge biting her palm. Jonah muttered, "Silent observer," as if the name carried history. Harris said, "You know him," but Jonah turned away, jaw locked. The man stood a few paces off, eyes shadowed, but his presence shifted the seams to ripple faster. Alex said, "He's affecting it," and her voice wavered. Claire said, "Then he's tied to it," but the air around her words bent like heat. The silent observer raised a single hand and pointed, not to the seams, but to Alex. Jonah growled, "Don't," and stepped forward, but the figure dissolved into mist, leaving only a heavier outline where the wall once held still. They retreated into the warehouse, the air thick with mold and oil. Harris said, "If we're followed, we trap him," and pulled his coat tighter. Jonah whispered, "You can't trap silence, and check the walls for cracks." Alex lifted her flashlight, beam cutting through rafters, dust falling like snow. Claire said, "This place feels wrong," and her breath shook the dust into spirals. The fob throbbed again, and Alex said, "It's leading us," though the words frightened her. Harris muttered, "Or it's baiting you," and the echo carried weight. Jonah crouched near a rusted hatch and said, "Another seam here," while the floor groaned under him. Claire whispered, "It's multiplying," and panic edged her tone. The warehouse light flickered, and shadows folded too many ways, as if doors waited in each corner. The hatch pulsed faint blue, and the seams on the walls shivered in response. Alex said, "It's connected," and her breath frosted, though the air was still. Jonah said, "This one takes deeper payment," and his voice cracked with something personal. Claire whispered, "Payment of what?" and her hands clenched white at her sides. Harris barked, "We're not sacrificing anyone," but his voice carried less conviction than he hoped. The floor groaned, and the hatch shifted as if breathing. Alex pressed the fob above it, and the symbol flared once then dimmed. She said, "It knows us now," and the dread spread wider than her words. Jonah stared at the hatch and said, "If it knows us, it will choose," and the silence afterward deepened into threat. Claire whispered Alex's name, and the warehouse lights snapped off, plunging them into a darkness that felt alive. Darkness wrapped the warehouse until the hatch flared again, casting them in ghostly blue. Alex Carter whispered, "It's not gone," and the fob burned hot in her palm. Claire Bennett said, "Something's below," and her voice quivered like glass. Jonah Price pressed his hand flat on the hatch and said, "It doesn't want her, it wants me." Harris snapped, "Explain," but Jonah's silence weighed heavier than words. The hatch thumped once like a heartbeat, and dust trembled from the rafters. Alex said, "Why you?" but Jonah's eyes avoided hers, guilt carved deep. Claire whispered, "You opened it before," and the accusation cut clean. Jonah admitted, "I let it take someone once," and the air thickened like smoke. Harris said, "Then you're the cost this time," and the hatch shuddered, waiting for choice. Jonah said, "It was Lena Walker's brother," and the words broke like brittle stone. Claire gasped, "You knew her family," and fury chased the sorrow in her eyes. Harris barked, "You fed it someone," and his hand tightened near his coat pocket. Alex stepped forward, the fob humming louder, and said, "The seam marked you." Jonah's voice cracked, "I thought it would end if I obeyed." The hatch throbbed harder, like it agreed with confession. Claire shouted, "You brought it here," and the warehouse vibrated with her words. Harris said, "He's tied to this thing," and his voice shook with both anger and fear. Alex stared at Jonah and whispered, "Then maybe you're the key," and the air stilled, heavy as stone. The seams brightened, and the walls seemed ready to swallow them whole. The hatch yawned wider, light spilling into a shape that wasn't space but memory. Alex saw a bedroom she once slept in, walls curling inward like old film burning. She said, "It's showing me," and staggered back. Claire clutched her arm and whispered, "It knows your past." Jonah shook his head violently. "No, it crafts lies from what you fear most." Harris's eyes narrowed, and he muttered, "Or truths you've buried." The hatch flickered again, this time showing Lena Walker reaching toward them with hollow eyes. Claire screamed, Lena, and rushed forward, but Alex pulled her back just in time. The vision dissolved into static haze, leaving the hatch dark and hungry. Jonah said, "It feeds on trust," and the words dripped like poison. Alex whispered, "Then it already has plenty." Jonah's voice dropped, raw and jagged, "I bargained to survive." Alex said, "Who did you sacrifice?" But the answer was written already in his face. Claire hissed, "You let Lena vanish," and her fists trembled with fury. Harris said, "Then he's the thread unraveling this mess," and his words hit like iron. Jonah shouted, "You don't understand, it doesn't stop until someone is given," and his voice echoed with panic. Alex stepped closer, holding the fob high, and said, "Then it will stop with truth." The walls flickered, seams pulsing, brick blurring like water. Claire whispered, "It's listening." And the silence deepened until only breath remained. The hatch groaned like a throat clearing, and the floor cracked under Jonah's feet. Harris shouted, "Move," but Jonah stood rooted, the weight of guilt keeping him still. The hatch erupted, light pouring like liquid fire, and Jonah screamed, "It's me it wants." Alex lunged, grabbing his arm, shouting, "Not this way," but the floor crumbled under his weight. Claire cried, "Don't let go," her voice splitting the air. Harris tried to pull both, but the force dragged Jonah deeper. Jonah looked at Alex with hollow eyes and whispered, "Forgive me," before the light consumed him. The hatch slammed shut, the seams collapsing with a shiver. Alex fell back hard, the fob cold as ice in her hand. Claire sobbed into her sleeve, and Harris stood frozen, silence crushing the space. Alex whispered, "He was the bargain all along," and her voice broke into the dark. The warehouse groaned once more, and a distant door clicked, unseen but waiting. Silence packed the warehouse until the rafters clicked like cooling bones, and Alex Carter steadied her breath. Claire Bennett said, "He chose it," and the words shivered as if the room disagreed. Detective Marcus Harris muttered, "Choice is a story we tell after the fall," and his eyes avoided the hatch. The brass fob lay on the floor where Alex had dropped it, and it beat once like a slow pulse. Alex said, "It is not finished," and the seams along the walls brightened to a dull bruise. Claire stepped closer and whispered, "Then we finish it before it finishes us," and resolve caught. Harris said, "We file a perimeter and call it in," yet the formality sounded like surrender. Alex picked up the fob and felt it tilt toward the eastern wall as if sniffing. A hush pressed in, and a draft threaded past them from no door at all. The warehouse held a breath that was not theirs, and waited for someone to claim it. They moved into the corridor where rain tapped the broken windows like skittering keys, and the building remembered other nights. Harris said, "This is where a man vanished 10 years ago," and regret bent the syllables. Alex asked, "You worked that case?" and the answer arrived before his nod. Claire said, "You knew about seams," and anger sanded her voice flat. Harris whispered, "I saw a wall breathe," and I buried the report, and shame slowed his feet. The fob warmed in Alex's hand like agreement with a charge long overdue. She said, "Then you helped me make it breathe on purpose," and the corridor dimmed. Claire touched a rusted doorframe and murmured, "Lena belongs in the file you never wrote," and the truth cleared fog from her eyes. Harris faced the brick and said, "I owe a door and a family," and the admission unlocked the air. The seam woke with a sound like wet paper torn carefully. The seam quivered, thin as a vein, and a whisper braided from old voicemails crawled along the wall. Alex said, "Play it back," and Claire opened the recording where her name wore a stolen cadence. Harris counted softly, 1, 2, 3, and the timing matched the knocks the hatch had learned. Alex pressed the fob to brick, and the symbols aligned with hairline mortar like magnets meeting. She said, "If it once cost, it can have my secret," and the vow tasted metallic. Claire said, "Not your life," and grief flared hot, then cooled to steel. Harris added, "You pay with truth, not blood," and his voice held. The wall flexed inward like canvas, and flashed an iron face for a breath long enough to change them. Alex whispered, "Show Lena Walker," and the seam widened to a slit of moving dark. The air folded, and the corridor tilted toward a room that did not exist yesterday. They stepped to the threshold without crossing, and a room arranged itself like memory trying to be a place. A chair waited with its back turned, and a coat draped on it carried rain from a storm not theirs. Alex said, "Lena, speak if you can," and the darkness answered with a soft intake of breath. Claire said, "I am here," and the reply arrived as the faintest handprint fogging unseen glass. Harris gripped the frame and whispered, "The last man begged me to close it," and his knuckles whitened. The seam pulsed, asking for weight, and Alex loosened a secret she had locked behind jokes and distance. She said, "I left someone once when fear was louder than love," and the room steadied like a listener. Claire exhaled and said, "You are not that leaving now," and warmth traveled the sentence. The chair turned with no one touching it, and a key fob's twin rolled out and kissed the floor. The twin fob vibrated against the concrete and sang a tiny note that bent the corridor straight. Alex said, "Take it," and Claire knelt, fingers steady as if holding a pulse. Harris said, "If crossing is a trap, we drag the truth back instead," and he braced the doorframe. Alex lifted the first fob and aligned it with the twin, and the symbols faced each other like mirrors. She said, "Debt cancels debt," and the seam swelled, then narrowed to a sharp, obedient line. A voice like hers answered, "Payment accepted," and the air lost its taste of iron. Claire said, "Where is Lena?" and the corridor windows fogged in the shape of an address half-written. Harris read the pattern and said, "Storage yard by the river," and hope arrived loud and awkward. The seam sealed flat, and the warehouse exhaled like a patient waking. Alex pocketed both fobs and said, "We run now," and the city opened its lanes. The river yard crouched under midnight fog, and chain-link fences hummed with passing trucks. Alex Carter said, "Unit C-17, as if naming it could warm the air." Claire Bennett answered, "We bring her out, then burn the map," and fear steadied to purpose. Detective Marcus Harris checked the lock and said, "Fresh scrape marks," and regret dragged at his voice. A shape moved inside the container, soft as breath behind canvas. Alex lifted both brass fobs and whispered, "Debt cancels debt," and metal clicked like teeth. The doors groaned, and cold rolled out like a tide from nowhere. Claire said, "Lena Walker, speak if you can," and the fog leaned closer, listening. Harris counted to 3, and the numbers walked the steel. The doors opened on darkness that felt like a paused story waiting for its voice. Inside, a narrow passage opened like a throat, and pallets stacked to the ceiling shaped a false hallway. Alex said, "Stay to my left," and her light drew a thin road over dust. Claire whispered, "I hear someone," and the sound tugged her forward. Harris muttered, "No echo," and his fear respected the physics that refused to answer. A figure sat bound in shadow, shoulders quaking with slow, stubborn breath. Alex said, "Lena Walker, we are here," and the name softened the dark at the edges. The ropes cracked as she cut them, and cold bit through her sleeves. Claire said, "We are leaving now," and her certainty fought the space that wanted to keep count. Lena coughed once and whispered, "It opens when I blink," and the room sighed like paper. Harris said, "Eyes on me," and the way out seemed to remember them. They reached the threshold, but the fog had thickened like felt, and shapes pressed in where shapes should not be. Alex said, "Hold my sleeve," and Lena's grip steadied into need. Claire breathed, "Almost there," and the promise ran ahead like a scout. Harris froze as a tall silhouette took form by the fence, and did not move at all. The silent observer watched without blinking, and the yard's lamps dimmed as if he drank them. Alex said, "You pointed at me before," and the words carried a debt that had learned to walk. The girl lifted a hand and turned its palm outward, refusing answers with ritual ease. Claire said, "He is not stopping us," and fear dared to become defiance. Lena whispered, "He is counting," and the numbers lived in the fog. Harris said, "Keep moving," and the gate answered by unlocking itself. On the street, sirens moved like distant weather, and the city inhaled them as if to quiet a storm. Alex said, "Lena, how long were you gone?" And the answer hesitated between hours and years. Claire wrapped her coat around Lena and whispered, "You are safe now," and safety tried to believe her. Harris said, "Ambulance 2 blocks out," and his voice found a steadiness it had lost. The brass fobs in Alex's pocket warmed until they clicked against each other like teeth. She said, "It is not done," and the curb trembled with a thin tentative vibration. Lena stared at a brick wall across the street and said, "It follows the one who listens hardest." Claire said, "Then it follows us all," and resolve chose a place to stand. Harris rubbed his wrist and said, "Not tonight," and the night considered his claim. The wall held still, but the mortar looked wet. The ambulance lights approached, and for a breath the world synced with clocks and rules again. Alex said, "We will map the seams and close them," and the plan steadied her bones. Claire answered, "Together," and the word anchored them to the curb. Harris said, "I will write the report I erased," and the vow cleaned the air. Lena looked past them and whispered, "Do not blink," and the warning arrived too late. Across the street, a door printed itself into the brick like a wet stamp, and smiled without edges. Alex faced it, and both fobs vibrated, aligning to a geometry she could almost read. The silent observer stood beneath a failing lamp, and lowered his hand, as if ending a prayer. Claire said, "Walk away," but her feet did not obey. The door vanished, and the ambulance siren cut, and the night kept their names.